The fact that ancient Egypt had a prominent slave trade is well known. But when we think about slavery, we inevitably view it through the frame of the transatlantic slave trade. It is easy to forget that slavery was an integral part of the majority of historical civilizations, and that it was an accepted part of society for most of human history. Slavery began in ancient Mesopotamia, and the practice was well established by the time the pharaohs ruled Egypt. Egyptian slavery has been studied extensively by modern Egyptologists. So while you may be thinking you already know everything about slavery in Egypt, keep watching for some facts that might surprise you. Number 1. Children could be slaves, but there were restrictions. While it was common for people captured in battle to become slaves, slave markets would accept anyone. That meant that anyone could offer themselves up to live as a slave. Sometimes debts could be paid off by selling family members, especially women, into slavery. But it wasn't uncommon for people to volunteer to be sold. You may be asking, why would anyone do that? Well, for Egyptians who fell on hard times, slavery meant guaranteed food and shelter in exchange for servitude. Similarly, low-income families would often sell their children to the slave markets. This meant money for the family and perhaps the chance of a better life for the child, as slavery in ancient Egypt was not necessarily a life sentence. As part of the laws regarding Egyptian slavery, children of enslaved people were viewed as the property of their masters. However, children in ancient Egypt were held in high regard, so even enslaved children were not usually mistreated. It was forbidden to force an enslaved child into hard physical labor, and many were likely either taught a trade or educated to a certain extent. The idea of selling your child into slavery is inconceivable to most of us. But in ancient Egypt, enslaved children were under the care and protection of their masters. Hence, those who sold their children into slavery usually did it out of a desire for their children to be in better care. Number 2. They sometimes had desk jobs. While many Egyptian slaves were used in mining and agriculture or as servants, this was not always the case. If they were lucky, an enslaved person might have been chosen to be trained as an accountant or scribe. These were highly sought-after positions in Egyptian society, as only a small percentage of the population were literate. Since scribes and accountants were well respected in Egyptian society, most were free. But this did not exclude enslaved people from taking the position in certain circumstances. Alongside administration, some of the better jobs that were open to Egyptian slaves were dancer, musician, or household servant. The worst position an enslaved person could find themselves in was working in the gold and copper mines. This job was dangerous and exhausting, and many enslaved people would perish. Given the dire conditions of this type of work, it seems likely that this job was reserved for those who were enslaved as punishment. Number 3. They didn't build the pyramids. This one will probably be a little divisive, as this was a widely held belief until recently. The idea that enslaved people built the pyramids was enforced by the Greek historian Herodotus and the biblical book of Exodus. Herodotus recorded that an overbearing and unpopular pharaoh had ordered the building of the Great Pyramid, and that he had forced slaves to labor on its construction. However, the Great Pyramid was already over 2,000 years old by the time Herodotus was writing, and the Persians controlled Egypt. Many historians now believe that Herodotus either misunderstood the situation or that propaganda had been used to defame the ancient pharaohs. As to the Book of Exodus, while most scholars maintain that this was a historical event, the accuracy of the biblical description is still debated today. Hollywood depictions of the building of the pyramids have also contributed to the belief that mistreated slaves were the primary workforce behind the construction of the pyramids. Despite this being a long-held belief, overwhelming archaeological evidence suggests that most people working on the pyramids were skilled laborers compensated for their work. Tombs of deceased builders have been found near the pyramids, and the tombs were equipped with generous supplies for the afterlife. Many historians now believe that the building of the pyramids helped the Egyptian economy, and a sprawling settlement called el-Ghurab has been found that is thought to have been built to accommodate the workers. The settlement consists of barrack-style structures and catering buildings that would have housed and fed the workers. Inside the pyramids themselves, workers graffitied the name of their work gang onto blocks. They were usually named after the current pharaoh and included titles such as the Drunkards of Menkaure and the Followers of the Powerful White Crown of Khufu. Some suggest that working on the pyramids was a form of national service, and conscripts from various regions were employed as workers. Still, archaeologists have yet to find evidence that any of the workers were slaves. Based on the archaeological evidence, it is now understood that being employed as a builder of the pyramids was a respected job despite taking a physical toll on the workers. Examinations of the workers' remains show that many of them had developed arthritis, and the state of their lower vertebrae indicates that it was truly back-breaking work. The construction of the pyramids was a national project. It involved numerous professionals, including merchants and specialists to support and transport raw materials to the site, architects and project managers who oversaw the pyramid's construction, and the immense number of laborers who completed the work. Number 4. Slaves of the royal family had a better life than the free peasants. In general, enslaved people in ancient Egypt appear to have been treated better than those in other ancient civilizations. While the Egyptians certainly utilized free labor, they were not as dependent on it as other cultures were. This could be why it was so common for peasants to give up their freedom in favor of enslavement. Life as an enslaved person in ancient Egypt really depended on where you found yourself serving. The best place slaves could find themselves was serving the royal family or the nobility. These enslaved people were held in high regard, and many historians suggest they were treated as well as high-ranking free Egyptians. As a royal slave, you had many more opportunities to advance than those in other positions, including the free peasants. The life of an Egyptian royal slave was relatively luxurious. They had access to finer foods and garments than most Egyptians, and their status was elevated above most of Egypt's citizens. The position was one of trust and respect, as the royalty and nobility could not afford the chance that their slaves might turn against them. Slaves of royalty and nobility often received education and were likelier to become scribes or accountants. They also looked after the royal children and had more opportunities to improve their status through hard work and by demonstrating loyalty. Occasionally, the children of these enslaved people rose to high positions within Egyptian society, or even married into the families of the nobles or royals who had been their former owners. Number 5. Slaves had legally protected rights. Although the legal status of slaves has never been explicitly determined, most evidence suggests that they had more legally protected rights than enslaved people in other cultures. Despite being officially considered as property, it is thought that they could earn taxable income, start families, and keep their name. Historians believe that enslaved people were allowed to marry free people and own property under certain circumstances. Sadly, there isn't enough information to know for sure why the Egyptians treated their slaves better than other ancient cultures. One theory about this better treatment of slaves states their religious beliefs played a role. In ancient Egypt, it was held that the heart was the most important organ, as it was the center of thought and emotion. When an Egyptian died, they believed their heart would be weighed against the feather of Mut, the goddess of truth and justice. If one's heart was pure and light, one would be allowed to bask in the eternal peace of the afterlife. If not, one's heart would be fed to Ammit, who had the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the behind of a hippopotamus. One's soul would have to endure the torment of eternal death. Clearly, this was a good motive to behave kindly and treat your slaves well. Number 6. There were numerous ways a slave could be freed. Because enslaved people were not always seen as inferior to free citizens, they could potentially assimilate into society if they bought or were granted their freedom. There were different categories of slaves in ancient Egypt. These included chattel slaves, who were foreigners, captives, those born into slavery, or those who were found guilty of committing a crime, and bonded laborers, who were those who had sold themselves into slavery. Bonded laborers included children who were traded or forced into servitude to pay off debts. Alongside the many ways that people could become enslaved, there were many ways that they could achieve freedom. Enslaved people who were in debt were often only in servitude for a set amount of time. They were set free once they had paid off their debts or the agreed amount of time had passed. Enslaved people could buy their freedom. Friends and family of enslaved persons would be allowed to gift them money that could be used to purchase their way out of servitude. In certain circumstances, a slave could also gain their liberation by marrying or having a child with a free person. Occasionally, enslaved people were granted freedom by their masters. This was usually as a reward for their loyalty and hard work. The pharaoh also had the power to free enslaved people, and granted freedom as an act of mercy or due to the slave's exceptional service to the state. However, it is essential to remember that these roads to freedom were not accessible to all Egyptian slaves. Being an enslaved person in Egypt was entirely dependent on a person's background, how they became a slave, and what position they held while enslaved. Do you know any surprising facts about slavery in Egypt? Let us know in the comments below. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about ancient Egypt, check out our book, Ancient Egypt, a captivating guide to Egyptian history, ancient pyramids, temples, Egyptian mythology, and pharaohs such as Tutankhamun and Cleopatra. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you found the video captivating, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.